The late 19th and early 20th centuries were times of revolutionary literature. Since the end of the Civil War, authors and groups had become increasingly outspoken and more liberal in sharing their philosophies with the intention of swaying their readers' opinions. In this time, writers developed a sense of voice and of local humor in their work. Colossal pieces such as Mark Twain's The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Helen Hunt Jackson's A Century of Dishonor were produced in this period. Writers in this time, known as the Gilded Age, questioned American authority and interactions. The momentum building from progressive civil rights movements and the Civil War allowed Gilded Age authors to be the most influential writers up until their time. Helen Hunt Jackson was a lifelong appreciator of literature. In her young adult years, she was friends with the poet Emily Dickinson and later friends with a writer named Thomas Wentworth Higginson. Jackson brought about civil rights awareness for Native American communities through her literature, particularly A Century of Dishonor. Her famed work spoke about the plight of the Indians put on them by the American government. She was especially bothered that the United States government didn't follow up on the treaties that they had made with the Indian leaders. Her inspiration for A Century of Dishonor came from when she met a Ponca tribe leader named Standing Bear and a young Ponca woman named Bright Eyes, and they told her of the cruelties that the government had beset upon them. Many women's rights organizations that often functioned also as temperance organizations took on the burden of the Indians, and Helen Hunt Jackson inspired them through her literature. The way that her literature inspired women and others to take a stand for Native Americans' rights was an example of how angled authors were during the Gilded Age, a freedom that had scarcely been exercised in such a way previously. Arguably, an even more influential author was Samuel Clemens, famously known by the pen name Mark Twain. Clemens had lived in both the South and the North during and after the Civil War, so he had equal perceptions of racism all across the spectrum. This was reflected in his works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Mostly in the latter, the idea of freedom versus slavery is open to interpretation, and so the novel became a quintessential Gilded Age piece, the influence of which hasn't expired. The Gilded Age was such a time of freedom, seeing as the Civil War had ended and nearly everyone was legally free, and that was definitely reflected in the literature. The literature of this time was both historically and socially significant because of the way it affected people, and therefore left its print on history. The fact that this post-war period was called Gilded was represented well in this area because so many of the books, like those of Helen Hunt Jackson and Mark Twain, were deeply critical of American society. These authors cut into what looked like a time of prosperity to reveal darker details.